Today we have back, again by popular demand, Graham still continues to break most of our attendance records in terms of folks that want to hear what Graham has to say. I think it's his approach to these sessions that you'll like in terms of it being truly instructor-oriented and learning-oriented, and you walk away with some real good prescriptive guidance and some nuggets. Graham has over 20 years experience in business management and information technology that covers many skill sets and industries. Graham leverages this experience and finds synergy within his current practice of IT service management, within which he has earned multiple certifications, including ITIL Expert, ITIL Service Manager, and all ITIL service life cycles. Graham embodies a wealth of experiences and perspectives gained on the front lines. This includes ITSM process management design. It includes project and program management, business and systems analysis, application programming, database development, and operations management. These experiences come together in Graham's unique skill set that really, I think, sets him apart. His innovative and business-focused approach delivers service excellence in all projects that range from initial ITSM adoption phases through to ongoing service improvement. Graham is a regular contributor to Thought Rock and a regular industry speaker, and we welcome back. And Graham, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Great. Well, thanks a lot, Rick, and welcome everyone again to our Thought Rock lunch. And today should be an interesting topic because it actually came from a few different requests. Wanted to hear a little bit more about release and in conjunction how that relates to change. So our title today, Change and Release, they are related, but they're not the same thing, which is why we have two different process areas and concepts around these two areas. So today we'll keep it concise and to the point, but should be pretty interesting. And again, I'll throw out a couple of sort of key ideas that help to wrap your heads around these two concepts. So let's start off here with the quick agenda. You'll see it's fairly short, 5 basic sections, or really 4. We'll take a look at the goals of change and release, just to understand what they're aiming to try and control, and then understand the basic contents of what is a change and what is a release, and where are they different, how are they the same. And then continue to elaborate upon the differences and the similarities and the interconnections between these two things with some of the detail from the process flow themselves. So let's start off. We have half an hour to kind of go through these things, and the first one, we'll start off up here. What are goals of change and release? So here's the basic key things. In the blue text at the top here, this is where, right here, I'll put little markers on here. So number 1, change and release management both share a similar goal and objective because they have to respond to changing business requirements. So some are out there from the business or internal IT. We recognize we have to go and start modifying something in the production environment. And then further to this, we have to keep all of our systems running, which require regular maintenance and installation of patches and updates. And of course, when they fail, we need to maintain or restore any deviations that might happen. And of course, if we make a change, we have to raise a change. So how do these two things relate? Both of them have the same sort of top goal. If I bring up just some keywords I picked out of the release goals and objectives. First, within release management, its overall job is to protect the overall live environment, the production environment. We want to make sure everything that's currently there is running and not producing any bugs or defects, and that if we are developing anything new or making modifications, we're not introducing any defects or bugs into that environment. So the way we do that, the typical keywords, plan, build, test, and deploy. These really sort of state this is what release is doing in order to protect that live environment. So we plan how we're putting together our IT hardware and software and any other components, and building and thoroughly testing before deployment. So at the end of all this, release makes sure that they have a couple of handover activities. From the customer point of view, make sure they can use any new service that's impacted them. We want to establish effectiveness there. And from an operation and support point of view, we want to make sure that our support people also can take anything new or modified and understand who and how these components are being modified. So release is very hands-on. It's where typically we think about our development activities. And then if I bring up now a couple of key bullet points to say, well, here's the next focus of change. So with change, it's ensuring that each change we're making in our IT infrastructure delivers some type of value, or another way of thinking of it is justified to be done and approved by someone. Make sure that each change causes minimal service disruption. So again, don't put something into the production environment that either introduces a bug or may fail and bring down another part of our production environment. And we need to make sure each change is managed in a controlled manner. So if we look at these things, I don't know if everyone can see. I don't know, Rick, if you can see the clear difference between release and change. We have the commonality at the top, but there's a difference if you look at the wording between release and change itself.
Yeah, I mean, Grim, I guess I look at it and say, at minimum, from a metaphorically, release is kind of the guard. I mean, it's the security guard at the gate saying, you know, hold on a second, let's make sure that, as you mentioned here, it's protecting the live environment from whatever is trying to be done inside of change.
Yeah, actually, I'm going to reverse that. The guard, if you want to think of it, if you look at these words over here, and I kind of made sure I deliberately...
And this is why you're delivering this session. There you go. There's the confusion.
There you are. They both have the same, I mean, this is why it's confusing between the two processes, because they both have the same goal and objective, in that they're trying to make sure they aren't introducing bugs into the live environment or breaking anything. But in the general way of thinking of the two processes, release are your teams of people doing all the work. And because they're doing the work, they're the ones who are actually front and center protecting the live environment. So they're your technical people doing the hardware builds and software builds. They're the ones doing all of the testing. They're the ones doing the hands-on deployment. And change is a group of people who audit. That's the control process. They aren't the ones doing the release. They aren't the ones doing the change. They're going through each phase of an update, and they're saying, did we do this aspect here? Do I see test results? Do I see proper deployment plans? So the key words here, you know, change is an audit and a control process that monitors the activities of release and make sure that release is following a prescribed way of doing things, so that if anything does fail, we have an audit trail for it and that it's been done correctly. Okay, so that's the first thing I wanted to cover here, is just to make sure, you know, from a high-level point of view, we understand that we're both sharing the same high-level concept of let's manage all the business changes out there and our internal changes that come up from a failure or any type of maintenance. And release will be the people doing it all, and change will be the ones who are monitoring that each piece of an update is done in a specific way. So let's go a bit further into this, because I've got a few things to kind of bring out a bit more of those differences in definitions. So the basic definition of a release, it's the collection of hardware and software. Could include documentation and processes. You'd have to be a pretty mature process to include all of those updates. But these are the things that are implemented as a combination of one or more approved changes. So the release is the big thing. It's a collection of everything I'm doing. And we're using the word change in release, so we need to bring up that definition. So this combination or collection of changes to an IT service, each change is the monitored and controlled addition, modification, or removal of one of these components. So I have one more slide to bring this out a bit further. So change is the bigger, release is the bigger piece, and then change is your molecular or component level audit trail. So I've got another little model here, kind of bring some diagrams to this. So here we have a collection of components, and in the ITSM and ITIL world, we call these configuration items. So each CI is a specific component that's pulled together to form the larger definition, which is the release. So the release, again, is the big thing. It's your overall collection of built, tested, authorized, and implemented components. And then where change fits into this So if my release in this diagram had 6 individual components that are in some way being added, modified, or removed, then for each one of those components, I need to have a change record to make sure that each one of those components is properly audited and checked, go through the entire build, test, and implement process. So hopefully that makes it a bit clearer in terms of how these two are related. Again, because you can't have a release without having a configuration item, and you can't have a configuration item modified without having a change. That's why these two processes go together.
So, Graham, the key learning point on this slide again is what you just said. To repeat is that this means that is there a change record? A change record is created for each of those CIs in the diagram.
Yep. So in this case here, and actually that's a good point. I'll bring a bit more out of a little more interest from here. So we have 6 different configuration items. Therefore, we have 6 different change records. And we could even, at the higher level here, we could consider that the entire release may be a configuration item and a change record in itself. You know, we have to have some way to manage the big picture and to know that all of these individual changes relate to a bigger one. So, so each one of these things has a change record, and the change record may be at the higher level even up at the release level itself. So I'm sure that's making a few people think about things. And I'm sure that there's been a lot of confusion I found in the past where people say, oh, well, if it's something small, we don't have releases, we only have changes. Well, in the pure way of managing within the ITIL and the ITSM approach, you always have both. Even if all you're doing is updating a piece of software, a single configuration item, the release is the overall build, test, and implement of that, and the change would be one change record for that component. But you may manage it as a combination of this type of structure, where you may have two change records for it. So a little more about how we can refine this diagram and build a little more information into our release concepts and change concepts. So if I go to the next slide here and I take in another view of this diagram. So again, we still have the release at the top level here. And what I've introduced as a definition, we always talk about release packaging or release packages. And a release package, a number of different ways to look at it, but the basic concept here is that release managers and people in the release process, they're very good at knowing how to group components together that can be logically tested, built, implemented. They act as a single entity. So one of the key skills that we have within release management is knowing how these configuration items can link together, and then we can treat them as a single entity when we're especially doing our testing and deployment, because we know that we've already tested the interconnectivity of these pieces and that they logically belong together. And what you might do to simplify your life, you might say, well, instead of having a change record for 3 different components, if they're actually all related, maybe I'll just have a change record, and I'll consider that all 3 of these components should just be a single change record, because they are a single entity. Same thing might happen over here. So even though we have 3 individual CIs, we may treat them as a single item and therefore a single change record. So in a very complex release project, this might be a way of trying to think about how to simplify the larger concepts and get rid of having too many change records that we don't need to go down to that lower level detail. So I'm sure that's making a few people think too who are in the change and release area. But this is one way you might manage your change records. And no one's saying one way is more correct than another, but it's something to consider that might help you improve where you may have some challenges in managing the bulk of these records. So hopefully by now everyone got the idea. Release is a big thing. It's a collection of components. For each of those components we have a change record. And my next slide goes into the actual very bare bones process steps between change and release. So on the release side of things, sort of flowing down this way over here, we need to assemble a whole bunch of these release plans or project plans or component build plans. We need to think about the big picture. And in this case, I've got 1, 2, and 3 different folders of plans that the release process would be responsible for building up. Once we get these plans created, this will now give us an identity of what components are part of the larger release. And we need to send all of these things through the change process one at a time or maybe all at once, where now we go through each individual one where we record it as a separate change. It's going to be reviewed so we understand why it's being done and who's authorizing it to be done. We can properly assess how each individual planned component change has risk and has potential impact on our production environment, so each change can be handled according to its priority and risk. The CAB and all of the authorization step here, whoever needs to look at these component changes can look at it, have input to say, hey, we just noticed that you're trying to do an update when another update's happening, you might want to reschedule it. So the whole purpose of managing the smaller, lower level change components is that that's typically where things fail. And so for each one of those, the change process uniquely audits and checks to make sure we've got the best possible input for success. So if I add a little animation to this slide, so our plans go through one by one, those first 4 steps. And the whole purpose of those 4 steps is to make sure that they're properly understood. We properly can approve those plans to be done and they're properly scheduled. And then now everything's ready to move forward into the remainder of the release process. So coming out of this step here, we now can say, okay, things have been authorized. We've had the maximum input. Before we start major work, we've got the maximum input for success. So now we can just take these things down one step at a time. So one by one, we can build or acquire each one of these things. And release management is doing this step 5 of the change. So they're going to report back saying, here, we've built or we've acquired these components as per schedule. We're on track for our change. We can test those components and send the test results back to the change process. So for each individual change, we can say, we've tested it. Here's our test reports. You can validate those things. Then we can produce our deployment plans. Again, submit these to the change process to say, here's how we're planning to deploy. We can actually do it, and we have an initial assessment to each individual change to say it's been successful. And then during the review and close of each individual change, here's where we may have a waiting phase where one of the key concepts in release management, early life support, so we don't want to close our release project, and we don't want to close our change records until we have a little bit of a monitoring period. So during early life support, we're making sure we're monitoring incident management and the service desk are fully aware of these changes having gone through. After a sufficient amount of time, we can say, yes, each one of these changes here can be reviewed and closed. So we get 3 check marks because we had 3 component changes in plans. Now that our change tickets are closed, we can now close our release process. So yep, go ahead,
Sorry.
Rick.
Well, I just have a question. I'm not sure if it's the right time. I just want to make sure it gets addressed. So this is from Carolyn. Protect the live environment and ensure each change causes minimum disruption sound very similar. What comes first, the change or the release, and how are releases approved? Now, I don't know if that was part of where you're going and what you've already done. Just want to make sure that that question is addressed as you're at this point in the presentation.
Yep. No, that's okay. Release is the one protecting the live environment because they're the ones touching it. So the way that we make sure that release will touch things correctly is that by having a change record that audits who's doing what and what they're doing, all the change management is doing is to make sure that things have been properly planned, they've been properly assessed and given input. So this is this piece over here. And this is the key about change management. Change management, it's not about doing any of the work. It's about giving recommendations for success. So during the assessment and the authorization, as many stakeholders as need to be based upon complexity and risk, look at the change and say, hey, have you considered this? Because maybe you didn't know about, another component being changed that is related here. So all that information is sent back to the release process, and they say, oh, thanks for all the input. We didn't know that was happening. We'll update our plans based upon having proper stakeholder input. And now we can do a better job, and we can protect the live environment because we've included enough stakeholders to look at having input into what we're doing. So in this diagram here, release management, they're the ones doing all of these steps. Another way of thinking about change management, they're just looking at all of those steps to make sure that we have gone through in an orderly manner. We have had stakeholder input, and that we've got the best possible chance of not having a failed change, and therefore in the larger release we won't have a failed release. So that's kind of how those two pieces happen together. And in the perfect ITIL and ITSM world, you would have release before you would have change. And that's because release has to plan and come up with the way that we're doing something. And then those plans, as we had in this diagram here, those plans are then submitted to the change process. So in a perfect world, you never have release without change, and you would have release first to create the plans, and then they're submitted to change so that change can start tracking and assessing and giving some recommendations for each component of the release. So hopefully that clarifies that piece a little bit more, and it kind of gives you an idea, again, related but not the same. So we need a separate set of release process steps and a separate set of people doing the work, and then we need a separate audit process or a control process, which is what change is, to make sure that people aren't just saying that we've tested and come up with some modification to our plans. We actually have some accountability because you have to show these activity steps being done to the change process before you're allowed to go forward. So they both do the same, but again, they're a bit different in terms of where the hands-on happens. So this is really the bulk of the presentation, and I know we're pretty much just running towards the end of the half hour. And I've got only about 3 or 4 slides left for just a couple of success factors in all of this. So hopefully this is giving everyone at least a little bit to chew on and think about. And if we go down to finish off here, a couple of success factors. So the first slide I have, I'm going to have 4 of these sort of success factor slides. When you're thinking about implementing a process or a set of practices around change or release, typically you want to think about configuration in conjunction with those two. So this slide titled Change, Release, and Configuration should be considered together. So bringing up sort of a description of each one of these. So in a configuration process, that particular group of people or that particular process, they're going to identify the components that will be configuration items upon which we will then have change control, and upon which we will have release management who properly builds up their release packages and all of their bundling for building and testing. So you need configuration to say, well, here's my high-level identification of these components that we're all going to talk about with the same name and identifier. And then once they're identified, they're placed under change control. So again, change is the control process, but not the doing process. So we need to have release. So whenever CIs are changed, they have to be properly, right here, managed and handled by release management, who's doing all the actual work. And they raise a change for each particular component involved in the release. And again, it's a bit of a loop here because release may have suggestions for configuration. Oh, by the way, I handle this set of configuration items the same way each and every time. So maybe instead of having them labeled as 3 separate components, why don't we just call them one component? Because we always handle them the same each time as a single unit. So something to think about. Changes are on components. All of my release work is about building, testing, and implementing components. So we need the process to properly identify what the component is so everyone's on the same page. So that's sort of my first little success factor. Because they're interconnected, you want to think about enhancing and developing, moving these forward at the same time, all 3 of these processes. My next one.
Sorry, there's a couple of questions, but you just want to, because it's probably a good time to ask them. One is just on that configuration change release slide. What happens if you don't have configuration management?
Okay, and actually a lot of companies either don't have it or don't have full-blown configuration. You still do the work for change and release, and if you don't have configuration management, well, people still talk about components. So what you'll typically do, you'll start identifying specific low-level components. You'll start producing a lot more change tickets than you may have to, because we haven't thought about the proper concept of a configuration item, and instead we start talking about components. So we might get very detailed because we haven't got this configuration process to roll things up to a common identifier, and so we now identify everything at the lower level. So in every company, everyone knows about components. You know, on the back of all of your server boxes and desktop PCs, your monitors and so on, you all have some type of asset tags on them. So what tends to happen is that without formal configuration management, you drop down to the very detailed sort of asset level, and everyone starts using those numbers and talking about it that way. So it always exists. Even if you don't know it, there's always configuration management because people are aware of components that they have to look after and how they're properly tracked in the company. So it's there. It's a matter of whether or not you want to formalize it.
Okay, and I think back on slide 10. Can you go back to slide 10? Just a question, I think, on that. Yeah, that one. That with all the red on it.
Yeah.
Okay, so here's the question from George, and I think George is still on there. So he says, you're turning many assumptions on its ear, I think. Does RDM deploy in operations, or does change? This slide seems a little bit confusing, so maybe you just want to address that.
Yep, even in the operational environment, it's still under the release concept. That's where we do all of our deployment. So even if it's a small upgrade of a software patch, everything's done through the release management side of things, and we raise a change ticket, which will then be uniquely audited through the change process. And I think where George may have been having a point is, well, what about all those simple, low-level Microsoft patches we receive each week? And we want to run through and update them, and they're pre-approved changes. We don't send them through the change process. Well, my answer to that would be is that you do, because they're pre-approved changes. So you create a pre-approved change record, you document it, you do it, but doing the work is within the release sphere of control. So change is handled by creating a pre-approved change. That release would have to, whichever team is actually doing the work, that team would have to raise the pre-approved change, do the actual work, and in so doing, they're doing actually all of their work under the release process. So, you know, in pure raw concept, every time you do something, you have release management. Every time you want to track what you've done and make sure that it's properly monitored, you have a change record, which is triggering the change process. That could be a formal reviewed change record, which is a normal change, or it could be a pre-approved change record, which are the operational type of changes out there in business.
Okay,
it goes back to,
actually, oh, sorry.
Yeah, go ahead, Rick.
Yeah. No, are you done? If you're done, let me know, and then there's a number of other questions that have popped up here, so it's probably a good time to try to tackle some of these questions too.
Sure. Yeah, why not? We'll stay with this slide if that's where it is.
I'm not sure. This comes from Carolyn. Is it important that the change manager and release manager be separate people, or can one person share the roles? Practically and also by concept, it's better to be separate people because both will be fairly busy and both have a different skill set. So in release management, you're much more technical and you're much more thinking about the overall sort of project and build concepts, okay? Because we're doing all the actual work, and I need to make sure I know, my programmers know what they're doing, the hardware people know what they're doing. Whereas on the change management side, you're running a lot of meetings. You've got a lot of the CAB meetings. You're reviewing change records coming in. You're trying to understand their risk and the different ways I'm prioritizing things. So change is much more sort of audit and communication, whereas release is much more planning and project and doing type of work. So there's two different brain sets. Trying to wrap it up into one brain
it would be a challenge. So that's my advice on that one.
Okay, and what about, would the release manager make the physically, oh, I guess maybe they mean the physical. Would the release manager make the physical deployment / changes to the systems, or would the systems administrators do that work?
So read that one more time. Would they make the physical change?
Yeah. So would the release manager, I guess the individual, would they make the physical deployment / changes to the systems, or would the systems administrator do that work?
No. In the way I understand it, the systems administrators would do all of that work.
Right.
Now, when they're doing it, they would do it under the guidance of the release manager. So the release manager is the one who says, I know how to set up the standards and the procedures out there about how we do all of the build, test, and implement throughout the organization. Now, instead of having an entire group of people all within the release management process, I'm not going to do that because it would make no sense. I'll just simply, everyone in IT, if you do any work of touching the live environment, you're going to be given work that's underneath the standards and the approaches of the release management process. So again, in that scenario, the systems admin people, they would maintain their own system updates, and they would be doing it under the concept of the release management process, where if they're following a standard procedure in order to do those updates, those should be approved and maintained under the release process. So hopefully,
okay,
I think that should clarify that one.
And from David, what about combining config and change?
That one, actually, I've seen done many times, and I'm actually quite okay with that, because those two, every configuration item has to have change control on it, and we want to root out in our organization who's making changes that aren't approved. So they're very complementary, and mindset-wise, they're also very complementary. So I don't see a particular challenge about having change and configuration together. Might be a workload challenge, but that's about it. They fit well.
Okay, great. So Graham, I'm not sure, did you have a few more slides left? And that's all. We got right through the questions that were kind of posted, which was great. Thank you for doing that. If you want to keep going here, and we'll get wrapped up.
Yeah, like I say, I'm pretty much at the end. Just going back to where we were, it's just a couple of success factors that will help change and release, and we just covered the question on one of them. So back here, I mentioned change, release, and configuration. Think about configuration along with those other two processes. In the next slide, a little thought about project management, because quite often people, they're not sure how project management fits in with release. So a quick little definition here. Project management, it's the whole concept here of planning, organizing, securing different resources. It's all about a specific project goal and objective, right? We have a target. When we hit the target, we're done. So it's a temporary thing, and the project management activities are typically focused at a higher level. There's a lot more management of milestones and management of stakeholders and sponsors. So project management works very well with release management, because when you have a complicated release, typically we should have a separate process that's really good at managing the timing and the resources and the funding questions and all these different trade-offs. So project management works hand in hand with release management when you have something typically big or medium-sized happening. So if I compare the two pieces here, so in project management, again, if you look at the words, determine your high-level project charter, goals, and objectives. Come up with the high-level project plans, budgets, milestones. We're not doing the technical piece here. We're just doing very high-level sort of roadmaps. And then work gets done, which eventually, when I bring up the other side, will be release and deployment. And then at the end of it, get user sign-off and get support sign-off, right? Get everything signed off, and then the end, right? That project is finished, go on to another one. So in contrast with release management, so they're doing all the work, right? All of these things here. So they determine what will be the components of the release, the hardware and the software. They do, again, the plan, build, test, and deployment of all those pieces. They do the handover training and make sure people are capable of supporting and using the actual software. And then they don't finish off. So with release management, you now have business as usual. You just put components into the live environment, and those components need to be managed for the rest of their duration. So there's maintenance schedules. We talked about if there's a maintenance schedule from a systems team, they're going to be following that schedule within the larger context of maintaining the release. So it's the whole software development lifecycle here. Release management, they stay in the picture long after project management is gone. So that's really the difference here. And that's why project management is great to have it at the beginning when something is complicated, but then when it's hands-on business as usual, that's where we need to make sure release is looking after the big piece again by making sure that all the business as usual smaller components are being looked after. So project management is one of our success factors. And my last slide here, yeah, this is the last one for the day, is service level management. It's also going to help with the release and the change processes because ultimately the release is in some way delivering a service to the business. And that's where value is delivered. So we need to understand at all times what is the correct definition of success for my release. And as well, release policies. Rather than letting the business just come back every week saying, I need this update, this update, this update, we have a proper policy of release windows and when we go ahead and do all these business updates. So it's done in a much more controlled way. And at the other end of the schedule, or the scheme of things here, incident and problem management. So things will fail. We need to correctly identify these failures and link them back through a combination of understanding when an incident happens, can I look back to my release and change records, and can I figure out, did we do something in the release that may have introduced a bug into our environment? So we're constantly doing that. We're constantly putting things out there. It's a complicated world. It's basically our long-term monitoring to have incident and problem management to figure out when we may have inadvertently put a bug out there. So that's it. Those are all the slides I have. And I know we've gone a bit over.
No, we're good, Graham. That was excellent, as usual. Fantastic. And everybody stuck with it, which is typically good. And I think there's probably lots of other follow-up questions. And if you bring up the last slide, I think we've got some contact information there. If they have questions, you need to reach out either directly to Graham or just in general. We'll make sure those questions get to Graham. You can either, the best thing would be to info@thoughtrock.net to send those out, and we'll make sure that Graham gets it. And then at that point, you can also have direct contact with Graham if you needed to have a few other back and forth questions for him. But as usual, Graham, fantastic job. I know Graham is probably scheduled to do a number of these other small learning sessions within ThoughtRock over the next few weeks and months, so please stay tuned for that. And again, just wanted to highlight for everyone, next week we have another session, and next week we have Kathleen Wilson from Microsoft Consulting Services Canada, who will be presenting on cloud computing, the new black in IT. And again, if you go to ThoughtRock, if you look at the newsletter, you'll get more information on Kathleen's session, as well as the learning objectives that will come out of that session. And this will be Kathleen's first appearance on ThoughtRock Live. And as mentioned, to everyone that was on at the very beginning, is please go into ThoughtRock and add your ideas for potential content for not only the asynchronous learning that's in there in terms of e-learning nuggets, pre-recorded sessions, but also people or content that you'd like to see on these ThoughtRock Live sessions. This is a community for the members, and we continue to drive content based on member feedback. So for those of you, again, who continue to provide us feedback, we thank you very, very much and hope to see you again, you and your colleagues, on ThoughtRock Live again next Tuesday, 12 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. So that's it, I think, for the questions, Graham. And again, at this point, but I thank you and appreciate your time again. And we'll leave the information up in terms of the contact information for a few more minutes while we shut down the presentations. Thank you, everyone, and have a great week. Thanks,
okay.
Graham.
And thank you, Rick. And again, thanks, everyone. I enjoy challenging your thoughts here. So we'll see you next time.